Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Phil Martin. I'm the chair of the Department of Kinesiology here at Iowa State University, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Stephen N. Blair, a professor in the Departments of Exercise Science and Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of South Carolina, and the 2010-11 Dean Helen LeBaron Hilton Chair in our College of Human Sciences. Before I introduce Dr. Blair, it is appropriate to thank our college for the opportunity to host this year's Hilton Chair and also to comment briefly on who Dean Hilton was. Helen LeBaron Hilton served as Dean of the ISU College of Home Economics from 1952 until 1975. Throughout her career, she was recognized as a visionary leader in the home economics profession and as an advocate who advanced the status of women and the well-being of children. She was the first chairperson of the Association of Administrators of Home Economics of the National Association of State Universities and Land-Grant Colleges, and she was one of the first members of the American Home Economics Association Foundation Board of Trustees. Her bequest of over $1.4 million funds the Hilton Chair Endowment, which allows each year one of the College of Human Sciences departments to host the Hilton Chair. These individuals have come from a wide variety of career directions. They've come from academics, they've come from business, industry, government, and the media. Dr. Blair is the 17th Hilton Chair. And it's the Hilton Endowment that made tonight's event possible. So let me turn our attention to Dr. Blair. Simply stated, he is one of the world's leading authorities on exercise and its health benefits. So let me briefly provide some evidence in support of my statement. He's done extensive research examining the impact of diet, physical activity, and other lifestyle factors on mortality. He has delivered lectures to medical, scientific, and lay groups in 48 states and 30 countries. Maybe it's a growing list at this point. He has published over 500 papers and chapters in the scientific literature and is one of the most highly cited exercise scientists with over 26,500 citations to his name. I suspect by the time I finish this introduction, it might be 27,000. 1995 publication in the Journal of the American Medical Association has been cited more than 3,000 times, and a 1989 JAMA publication has been cited more than 1,500 times. Dr. Blair was also the senior scientific editor for the U.S. Surgeon General's report on physical activity and health. Dr. Blair is a fellow in the American College of Epidemiology, the Society for Behavioral Medicine, the American College of Sports Medicine, the American Heart Association, and the National Academy of Kinesiology. He was the first president of the National Coalition for Promoting Physical Activity and is a past president of the American College of Sports Medicine and the National Academy of Kinesiology. Dr. Blair is the recipient of 3 honorary doctoral degrees, the Doctor Honoris Causa of the Free University of Brussels in Belgium, Doctor of Health Science from Lander University in the United States, and Doctor of Science Honoris Causa from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. He's received many awards from professional associations, including the Honor Award from the American College of Sports Medicine and the Robert Levy Lecture and Population Science Research Awards from the American Heart Association. The American Heart Association has established the Stephen N. Blair Award for Excellence in Physical Activity Research in appreciation of his outstanding career as a clinical researcher working in the areas of exercise, physical activity, and cardiovascular health. Dr. Blair was granted a Merit Award from the National Institutes of Health and is one of the few individuals outside the U.S. Public Health Service to be awarded the Surgeon General's Medallion. On top of all of these accolades, Dr. Blair's a nice guy, and he's very generous with his time and his talents. As the 2010-11 Hilton Chair, he will visit ISU several more times during the academic year, and will work with faculty and students at ISU to expand the knowledge and research related to physical activity and health. I think you'll enjoy Dr. Blair's presentation tonight, which is entitled Physical Activity or Body Weight, Which is More Important for Your Health? Please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Blair.
Well, thank you very much, Phil, for an overly kind introduction. And I'm kind of astonished that here on this campus there are so many people who don't have anything better to do tonight than to come out and hear me babble on about some of my favorite topics. I'm truly honored to have received the Hilton Chair for this year, and I thank you, Phil, and the college and the university very much for that. It is always a pleasure to come back to the Midwest, the real heartland of America. I grew up on a farm out in Kansas. My grandparents, I think, were both born in Iowa. I know they lived in Glenwood for some years. And I actually have a diploma from an institution in Iowa. None of you have ever heard of this institution, but it's just up the road here in Mason City. The Reich American School of Auctioneering. When I was in high school, I thought, this looks easier than farming. Maybe I'll become an auctioneer. So I went up there one summer for a 2-week course. But anyway, and then, of course, that does bring me to the kind of sad point of being here in this part of the United States, this part of Iowa. I'll probably cry here in a moment, but given that we're pretty close to where on February 3rd, 1959, the day music died. And these young people are saying, what the hell is he talking about? They've never even heard of Buddy Holly, for God's sake, the premier musician of the 20th century. Well, anyway, we're supposed to be talking about physical activity or weight. Oh, not just body weight. Who made this slide? Okay, I am a professor. Some of you are professors, and you well know, and the students know, professors have the right to give pop quizzes. We're going to have one tonight. Look at these exposures, all of which all of you recognize are associated with poor health outcomes. How many think tobacco causes more deaths worldwide than any of the other items on the list? Come on, get with it now. Oh, you people. How many think it's physical inactivity? How many think it's high blood pressure? Some of you are trying to avoid voting. How many of you think it's obesity? Yeah, more hands for that than anything else, just what I thought. High blood glucose. Okay, you want to see the answer? Just about a year ago now, the World Health Organization published the leading causes, or the factors leading the cause of death around the world for the most recent data, 2004. It is high blood pressure, tobacco is second, glucose third, and physical inactivity ahead of obesity. You're going to find I don't like the obesity cartel very much, and I rant and rave about this. This really made my day when this publication came out. A little more recently, this year, risk factors for stroke. In this large multi-center or multi-country study, InterStroke, it'll be no surprise to anyone that these are attributable risks for stroke. So 52% of stroke deaths can be attributed to high blood pressure. But look at what is second, physical inactivity. Now, these two slides that I've shown you put physical inactivity kind of up there as a major cause of morbidity and mortality. But these data that I've just shown you are substantial underestimates of the real hazard of physical inactivity. And to illustrate that, here's a paper we have. It's still just online. I think it'll be out. God, it's been online for months. But a paper in the British Journal of Sports Medicine from this large population I've been following, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But here in this data set, we have self-reported physical activity. Do you walk, run, jog, go to aerobics class, what have you? When we when the individuals assign themselves to low, moderate, and high physical activity, you see for both women and for men, there is an inverse gradient across activity categories, and this is highly statistically significant. But now when you come over here and look at CRF, what in God's name is that? Cardiorespiratory fitness. All of these people completed a maximal exercise test on a treadmill. So we have an objective laboratory measure of their fitness. And look at this difference. Look at this effect in women and men. Instead of reducing the risk of dying by 10 to 20%, it reduces it by 40 to 50%. So all the data from the two slides I showed earlier were based on studies of self-reported physical activity and health. And it's lousy data. We may not ask the right questions. People may not remember. And then there are those, like Dr. Welk here, who might exaggerate a little bit how much he was doing. I know none of the rest of you would do that, of course. But you can't trick the treadmill. You can't lie to the treadmill. You go to exhaustion, well, anyway. Physical inactivity is the biggest public health problem of the 21st century. I'm going to try to convince you of that. Before we get to that, do we have an epidemic of obesity? Yes, of course we do. Only a fool would argue otherwise. It's around the world, all countries, the rates are going up. But the health effects of obesity are vastly overstated. And I'll just show you some examples of what we see both in the scientific literature and the popular press. There is no statement too outrageous for the obesity cartel to make it. Well, like this, this guy's obviously healthy, he's thin. And when I talk about this fatness, and I say you can be fat and fit and healthy, he says, oh, that doesn't seem right. I ask him to remember this guy. You all know somebody who's skinny who is very unhealthy. Maybe they already got disease, they smoke, use drugs, what have you. Here's an example from one of the world's leading medical journals, Journal of the American Medical Association. Paper 5 years ago, Obesity in the National Football League. Nearly all NFL players are overweight by BMI standards. Quarter of them are in class 2 obesity. Oh my goodness. BMI of 35 to 39.9. Or in other words, get the joke here, folks. NFL players are big. We had to take pages in JAMA. They rejected one of my papers to publish this nonsense. But I'm going to get back at them because I've got a new research study we're working on, National Basketball Association. I don't yet know for certain the conclusion, but I suspect it might be that they're tall. I'm an old 1960s liberal. I was delighted when Mr. Obama was elected. I admire Mrs. Obama as a woman of great achievement. I liked it when earlier this year she announced the Let's Move campaign. I like the title. It's to address childhood obesity. Although every single article I saw in the news media or even in medical or scientific journals where someone had interviewed people about Let's Move, I didn't see a single interview with Greg Welk or Russ Pate or somebody who actually works with kids in physical activity. It was all about nutrition. I'm not saying nutrition isn't important. It's just there's a great imbalance. Now, you've had a couple of minutes to look at this soundbite that somebody wrote out for Mrs. Obama, and I hope some of you are alert enough and clever enough to have said, what? Kids go to school 5 days a week, 9 months of the year. Most of them eat one meal at school, and they get 50% of their calories from that? That'd be a pretty darn big lunch. Well, it's nonsense, of course. Kids do not get anywhere close to 50%. Now, she said this in the context, we've got to improve school lunches. Do I disagree with that? Well, of course not. Now, here's a good one. New York Times a couple of years ago. This Greek doctor. You can all read. I don't have to read it to you. But take note of this. Now you see kids whose longevity is less. What does this tell you about this doctor's work life? It tells me he's examining dead children. Because I don't know what my grandchildren's longevity is going to be. They're both still alive, thank goodness. This statement you have seen many times. It is accepted as fact. This will be the first generation of American children whose longevity will be less than their parents. Well, you can make that wild speculation. You can believe it if you want to. I've got another one for you. Maybe some of you will sign on to mine. I think this is the first generation of American children who will conquer the laws of gravity and learn how to fly. You can't prove me wrong. We'll have to wait and see. Well, time may prove me wrong. So what is the cause of this obesity epidemic that's around the world? Well, it's really very simple. It's the calorie balance, energy balance. If you take in more calories than go out, you gain weight. If more calories go out than come in, you lose weight. It's a very simple concept. I have taught this to my 5-year-old grandson. He gets it. Not that complicated. Calories in, calories out. Take it with anyway. But this concept is poorly understood, even by luminaries of American science. Don Kennedy and Phil Albertson, I'm sure they're both members of the National Academies. Phil was the editor of Science, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, when they wrote this editorial on the obesity epidemic. What's wrong with this statement? You can all read again. So let's see, 3,800 twice. So that means, if my math is correct, the average American is getting 1,900 extra calories a day. Now, many of you are not physiologists, and you might not know this, but it takes 7,700 extra calories in the energy balance equation to lay down 1 kilogram of fat. Therefore, the average American is gaining 1 kilogram every 4 days, 90 kilograms a year. For those of you not attuned to the metric system, that's 200 pounds. This is the kind of crazy statement we see from brilliant scientists. I don't get it. So let's just go to the energy balance question. Is the average daily caloric intake of American adults, I'm going to talk about adults, is it increasing over the last 30 years of the obesity epidemic? How many think it's gone up? You're on to me. You know I've got something up my sleeve here. You sit there and afraid to put your hand up. But most of you think, I'm betting, that Americans are eating more than they used to, because you've read this 1 million times in the newspaper over the last 20 years. So the best data we have on this topic come from the National Health and Nutrition Examination surveys. Over this 30-year period, we have spent tens of millions of dollars measuring dietary intake through 24-hour dietary recalls. Here are the data for men. For the first 2 of these surveys, absolutely the same. And then it bumps up. And these 2 are the same. Pretty much the same pattern in the women. So you'd say, there, Blair, we caught you because the average daily caloric intake is going up. No, it's not. This difference is due to major changes in the methodology of doing this assessment. The first 2 surveys, these 24-hour recalls, were Monday through Friday. And the last 2, 7 days of the week. Now, no one in this room has ever eaten more on the weekend when you're watching the football game or something. Well, of course you have. But probably the more important change, I've got to be careful here. I know this is a College of Nutrition and Nutrition and Health Science, is it? So anyway, there are registered dietitians in the room, and I may make a really dumb mistake, and I hope they'll control themselves when I do. But the major change, I think, was the better probing techniques. There was much more extensive training of the dietary interviewers in the last two surveys compared with the first two. Now, what is this probing business? Well, let me do a 24-hour recall here on Professor Martin. And so the way these things start, we say, well, Phil, what time did you get up yesterday? And he said, about 10 o'clock, my usual time. Okay, good. I got to write that down. And then I say, did you have breakfast? Yes, I did. What did you have for breakfast? I had cornflakes and a cup of coffee. So in the old days, I would have written that down, and we'd go on, well, what about snack or lunch or whatever? But I've been trained. He said, cornflakes and coffee. So I say, Phil, did you put anything on your cornflakes? Well, some half and half and 6 teaspoons of sugar. Oh, how about your coffee? Well, full cream and 4 teaspoons of sugar. So by more probing, I discovered more calories. That, I think, and not only me, Van Hubbard, the director of the National Institutes of Health Nutrition Office, says the same thing. You cannot call this trends because of these huge changes in methodology. What about trends in energy expenditure? It's popular for the obesity cartel to say, well, the caloric intake has gone up, and they use data like what I just showed you, or even more flawed data than that. And they say, well, physical activity hasn't changed over 30 years, therefore the entire obesity epidemic is due to diet, not to physical activity. And I cannot get through to these people. Physical activity data we have from NHANES and other places are self-report of physical activity. That is not the same as energy expenditure. It's a part of energy expenditure, but that energy balance equation, it's total energy expenditure. Physical activity hasn't changed by self-report, but I think total energy expenditure has. But you've been looking at this slide, I expect, while I've babbled, but is anyone surprised that in this decade in China, the occupational energy expenditure went down in men and women, and that domestic energy expenditure went down in men and women? You're not surprised by that. Let's go to the U.S. Tim Church led this effort. We have this paper in review. We went to the U.S. Department of Labor over the last 50 years, and for each year show the service jobs. Oh, surprise, surprise. Service has been going up. Goods producing has been going down, mining and manufacturing. And right here is where I said, this farming is too much hard work. I'm going to get an education. And Granddad said, yes, Stevie, get an education and get yourself a job in out of the weather. I come from a poor family, first person to go to college. That was Granddad's criterion. Boy, if you can get a job in out of the weather, that's great. I did. So I got off the farm, as did many others over this period of time. So no one in the room, I suspect, would disagree with, yeah, this has been the pattern in the United States. So what we did then was go to these jobs and go to Barb Ainsworth's compendium and assign MET values to each of these job classifications. 1 MET is resting energy expenditure. 2 METs is double resting. 3 METs is triple. You get the idea. So for light activity jobs, and this would be maybe the clerk in a store where they're standing and moving around a little bit, we say, well, that's 2 to 2.9 METs. Moderate intensity jobs are 3 METs or more. This is walking at about 3 miles an hour, standing up, moving stuff, maybe putting things on shelves. But sedentary is sitting on your rear end, which is what all of you are doing at the moment, in fact. And again, no surprise. Look at the moderate intensity jobs, how much that's declined. Sedentary up, light up. So we then got a statistician to model these data, and we estimate that over this period of time, the average daily occupational energy expenditure has declined by this amount in men and this amount in women. Even for professors, there's been a decline in occupational energy expenditure. When I started, and maybe Phil started a few years after that, we didn't have computers. If you were lucky enough to have a grant and have an administrative assistant, you'd say, come on in, I want to dictate a letter. And the person would take the notes and they'd type it up and they'd bring it back and you'd cross it out and so on and so forth. And then it would go in the filing cabinet and get mailed. And now it's all done by computer, all sitting on your rear end, hardly moving around at all. So even professors spend less money on the or less time on the job in higher intensity activities. So we then modeled the average or estimated the weights of adult Americans using these occupational energy expenditure data at these different time points, which correspond with the Ian Haynes survey, where we have measured weights of Americans. So this is the measured weight of men. This is what we predicted from that occupational energy expenditure model in 1971 to 74, and so on and so on. And the same, you see, it's a very tight relationship. In fact, the R-squared value for our estimate of weight and the measured weight is 0.92. No one in this room, I'm guessing, unless there might be a physics professor here who had R-squared, a 0.9. We never see numbers like that in the kind of work that most of us do. So the cause of the obesity epidemic is declining occupational energy expenditure, and we don't have data on domestic energy expenditure, but I suspect that's making a contribution. When grandmother made dinner, first of all, she'd been for months digging and hoeing and growing the vegetables. She went out and pull the carrots up out of the ground and scrub them and wash them and peel them and slice them and stir them. And now, go to the freezer, bag of carrots, microwave, that's it. Everything we do is easier. Well, anyway, let's come to fitness, fatness, and health. I'll show you some data from this large cohort that we've been following I've been following for 30 some years. That's a large group of people examined at the Cooper Clinic in Dallas. So in contrast to probably most epidemiological studies, we have objective laboratory data on this large group of men and women. Lots of lab data, clinical tests, not only height and weight and body mass index, but percent body fat, waist circumference, and cardiorespiratory fitness from a maximal exercise test on a treadmill. So we've got objective data, and of course, this is determined primarily by your physical activity habits. There's a genetic component. I defy you to name me anything we can measure in human beings that doesn't have a genetic component. But according to Claude Bouchard, the world authority on this, the genetic contribution to fitness is actually less than the genetic contribution to blood pressure and body weight and a number of other variables. So yeah, there's a genetic component, but it's mainly determined by your physical activity habits in the weeks, months before you were tested. So we have a better measure of habitual physical activity than if we ask people about their activity habits. Our first report on fitness and mortality now is 21 years old, but you see the low fit, moderate fit, and high fit death rates in men and in women. Very similar pattern in men and women. We have a lot more men in this cohort than we do women, and I wish we had more women. Because you blasted women, I'm sorry, Rose, are just not good subjects for research such as this. The men are much better subjects. The darn women won't die. And the men give us lots of endpoints. I mean, if you want to study mortality, you have to have dead bodies. So we got fewer women and they don't die. And this epidemiology is a gruesome business, I'll tell you. And next Halloween, almost a year from now, dress up like an epidemiologist to go trick-or-treating. It'll scare people to death. But anyway, the reason I make that dumb joke is that here we haven't had enough deaths in the women for this analysis. I will show you some data only in men. It's not because I don't like women, it's because we don't have enough endpoints for some analyses to do it in men and women. But wherever we have enough endpoints, the findings are very similar in women and men. We then, I'm getting into the fitness-fatness thing here, we then begin to think, gosh, this fitness is such a powerful determinant of mortality. I wonder how it compares to the other well-established risk factors: smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. So in this report, 14 years ago, we again categorize these, this is men only, low, moderate, and high fitness, men who had none of the other risk factors, men who had any one of the three, any two, or all three. In each of these risk factor groupings, it's a significant inverse trend across fitness categories. And look at this. The high fit guys who smoke, have high blood pressure and high cholesterol, had a death rate of about 23 per 10,000 man years. The low fit men with none of those risk factors had a death rate of 30. These guys were more likely to survive than these guys. So if there are any physicians in the room, don't congratulate yourself too much if you've got a patient, you've gotten to 0 risk factors. Don't congratulate yourself until you know about their fitness, or at the very least their physical activity habits. And one other point I should make, you should be thinking of this, well, what do I have to do to get out of low fit to moderate fit? This is the bottom 20%, the couch potatoes. To get from here to here, 3 10-minute walks a day, 5 days a week will do it. To get out here in the high fit group, you have to probably do some vigorous and more activity. But this is the consensus physical activity guideline, official guideline of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. 150 minutes of walking a week. Or if you want to do something vigorous, then you can do it in half the time. 75 minutes of vigorous will produce this moderate fitness that is highly protective. Now then, specifically to the fitness-fatness issue, this paper, again, several years ago, remember we have percent body fat in this cohort from laboratory measures. Excuse me. So we sort these guys into low fat, kind of normal fat, and then here's some of us in the high fat category. 25% or more of their body weight is fat. Fit and unfit. This is the relative risk of dying from all causes or from cardiovascular disease. You can see that for all-cause mortality, it's 1.5 to 2 times higher risk if you're in the unfit group. In both of these analyses, it's the unfit ones who die, not the fit ones. These are not the marathon runners. They're at least moderately fit. Look at this. The thin guys, the skinny guys who are unfit, were twice as likely to die during the follow-up, which on average was, 10 years or something like that. Twice as likely to die as the fat guys who were fit. Yeah, right. Or, I've published a few numbers in my time. My 2 very favorite numbers are on this slide. This is where we look at waist circumference, which we had only on a subgroup of these guys. And this is kind of the cut point for high waist circumference, indication of excess visceral adiposity. So look at this. The guys with big fat waists, yeah, I still qualify. The guys with big fat waists who are fit had 1/5 the risk of dying of the skinny guys, narrow-waisted guys who are not fit. Fitness is what's important. And being fit wipes out the risk associated with adiposity and fat distribution. We did ultimately get enough data in women to carry out a similar analysis. This is with body mass index, sorting them into normal, overweight, and obese categories. But the pattern is very much the same as what I've shown you for the men. The obese women who are fit, much lower risk of dying than the normal weight women who are not. Where's all this hype about the obesity epidemic? Every week in the world's scientific and medical journals, in the very best journals, there's one last week this week in the Archives of Internal Medicine, you'll find a paper on obesity and some health outcome. If you're interested in the topic, get that PDF and then go up here to Find. And in Find, you type in physical activity and then hit Return. And if 1 nanosecond later it says term not found, discard that PDF. It's junk science. You cannot study, in my opinion, obesity and any health outcome without having a proper measure of physical activity or fitness and take it into account in the analysis. I would never try to publish a paper on fitness and health if I didn't have data on BMI, percent fat, waist circumference. I'd never get published. They'd laugh me out of, they'd say, rejected, and don't ever send us an article again because you're too stupid to publish in this journal. And yet, every week, in the obesity cartel, somebody publishes one of these papers. And let me tell you, you may not be able to detect this. I'm getting really irritated by that. Here, one of our more recent papers. This is adults in the prime of life, men and women 60 and older, in percent fat. Here are the fit ones, the normal fat or the over fat. Here are the unfit ones, normal fat. There's no difference based on obesity. It's the fitness that is important. Even in people with disease. Here are men, 2,300 men, with physician-diagnosed type 2 diabetes. Low, moderate, normal weight, overweight, obese, low, moderate, high fitness, low, moderate, high fitness. There aren't a lot of, excuse me, there aren't a lot of obese guys who are high fit. If you look around this room, you could find one who is obese and high fit. So in this analysis, because of the smaller, we combine moderate and high fit, but look at the risk of dying of cardiovascular disease. In the normal weight, relative risk of 4, here 1.5 or 2. These guys are twice as likely to die. In this city today, there were probably hundreds of patients with type 2 diabetes who went to see their primary health care provider. I would wager that every single one of them had their height and weight measured, their body mass index calculated, sorted into one of these categories, and I'll be very surprised if any of them had their fitness measured. I'm getting a little irritated by this. Same thing in men with hypertension. Again, physician-diagnosed hypertension, low or normal percent fat, obese by percent fat, low, moderate, high cardiorespiratory fitness. Again, it's the fitness that's important. Same thing if we look at waist circumference and fitness. So don't get your hopes up too much. This is just a summary of the first third of my talk. But I'm not saying that we should ignore obesity and fat distribution. They're health issues. It's a bad public health sign. But we should take activity into account. Both of these things are important, no question about it. But if we use an objective measure of activity, either by fitness or with accelerometry or some other method, we will find that obesity is not very important. So, if you get into middle age, and let's say you're a little plump, and every time you see your doctor, the doctor says you should lose some weight, is it a good idea to lose weight? Will it improve your health? Now, let me say, however, if you are single and middle-aged, and you would rather not be single, then yes, losing weight will definitely have advantages. Or if you want a promotion at work, or if you're unemployed and you want a job, and there's all kinds of bias and discrimination, but will it make any difference to health, or let's say to mortality? So D.C. Lee presented this at ACSM this year, and we're still trying to get it published. But these men had at least 2 exams, and some of them had 20 exams over the follow-up period, over 900 deaths. So we were addressing the question, You get to be middle-aged. Do I have the age on? I think the age it starts with, on average, 45. So if you're 45 years old, does it make any difference whether you gain weight or lose weight in terms of mortality risk? Makes no difference at all. This is percent body fat, those who lost percent fat, those who gained percent fat. It makes no difference in mortality risk. Can you guess what the next slide is? What is it, Greg? Fitness. Yes. Does it make a difference? Absolutely. Those who lose fitness, higher risk. Those who gain in fitness, lower risk. So how are we going to deal with this major public health problem? I think the biggest public health problem of physical inactivity. Well, we've got to figure a way to get around this engineering energy expenditure out of life. And this is just one example. Riding lawnmowers. There's a guy on my block that has a lawn that's about as big as this space here with a riding lawnmower. He has to back out on the street to turn around. You know, it's crazy. Riding lawnmowers. Well, it's just one. We could come up with 1,000 examples. Microwaves, leaf blowers. God, what an abomination. But we're engineering energy expenditure out of life, domestically, at work, and so forth. And in fact, Wim Saras and I were co-chairing an American Heart meeting a few years ago, and Wim made this statement. I liked it so much I stole it from him, that just by all indicators, dramatic decrease in the last few decades. So Wim, good Dutchman that he is, has a solution for the riding lawnmower problem. Want a riding lawnmower? There you go. Wim's got one for you. Or you could get a lawnmower like the Blairs have. They still make these. Lowe's, Home Depot, they're cheap. And they are selling. This was my wedding anniversary present to my wife, I think, for our 42nd wedding anniversary. I mean, it really is the other Dr. Blair's lawnmower. But if you look, she's so happy. She loves this lawnmower. She's now got another new one. I mean, I buy them just, every couple of years. So fellas, take this down. Get out your pen and take this down. Wedding anniversary, Valentine's Day be coming up here, Christmas coming up. Forget the chocolates. Forget the jewelry. Go for something, she'll love it, trust me. She'll really appreciate that this lawnmower keeps her fit, healthy, and also, then it's Grandma's and Jax's lawnmower. And, he loves it. And it's a struggle, you can see, for him. But the grass wasn't, we'd been out of town, I guess. But he can manage to push it. So we're bringing this, giving this boy a good example. Now at home, what does his father have? Riding lawnmower, you got it. And not the bicycle kind, I'm telling you. Now, Blair is not big enough yet to push the lawnmower, but you can see, look at the little girl's face. She loves it there with Grandma cutting the grass. So anyway, build more activity back into life. Attributable fraction, something that epidemiologists like to do. I showed you one slide earlier. It allows us to calculate the percentage of, in this case, deaths in a population that we can say are due to or are attributed to some particular exposure, some particular risk factor. And I don't even know how to do these calculations. I've got very smart postdocs and people on my staff who actually know how to do it, but I know the concept and the concepts. And that is, it's based on the strength of the association. So the stronger a risk factor is associated with the outcome, the higher the attributable fraction, and the prevalence of the population. So let us just say that Porsche Boxers were death traps. I do care. He's going to take me back to the airport on Saturday morning. But as a public health issue, it's trivial. There aren't enough people who have them. If Toyota Corollas are death traps, see, this is the prevalence issue. So the strength of the association and how common it is in the population. Well, here in these 50,000 men and women, where we calculate the attributable fractions, and each of these, this is percent, I don't know what happened to the percent, each of these calculations is adjusted for age, year of examination, and each of the other items on this chart. So we're trying to isolate on the attributable fraction for each of these risk factors. And you don't have to be an epidemiologist to see which is most important. 16 to 17% of the deaths that occurred in this population we attribute to low fitness, 2 or 3% to obesity. Smoking, 8-9%. The only thing that's even close is hypertension in men. This is how important inactivity and low fitness are as health indicators. So what are we going to do about it? Fortunately now, finally, and I know I make a business, I guess, out of irritating people in the nutrition community, complaining about things, but we've had U.S. dietary guidelines for, I think, about 30 years. Official U.S. government dietary guidelines. These are the first. We at least finally got official DHHS guidelines. So we made some progress. I'm not against nutritionists, believe me, and good diet. It's just an example of why have we gone on 25 or 30 years saying it's important to have dietary guidelines, and it's only in 2008. Well, at least finally the federal government did it, and they did a great job with it. They had a group of external scientists who wrote a 700-page report summarizing the evidence, and then the government scientists made these guidelines, and they did a spectacular job. You've already figured out I'm an old grouch, and when the guidelines go, I'm going to look at this. And I was kind of disappointed I couldn't find anything to criticize. They did an absolutely wonderful job. So certainly those of you in kinesiology, if you're interested in public health, well, every citizen needs to know what these guidelines are. The guidelines themselves are, I think, 45, 50 pages, something like that. You can find them at this website or just type in physical activity guidelines and see the details. And then finally, in 2010, May 3rd, we released the first ever physical activity plan, national plan for physical activity. Many countries around the world have had these plans for physical activity for many years. We've had a national arthritis plan, a cholesterol education plan, but now we also have a physical activity plan. So all of us, certainly in the business, every citizen, I hope, everyone interested in medicine, public health, should try to help promote the physical activity guidelines. I don't have time to go into this in any detail, but the guidelines address 8 sectors: transportation, urban planning, clinical medicine, public health, education, not-for-profit, corporate. I can never get all 8. I usually get 7 different ones, but there are 8 sectors. There are strategies and tactics for each sector. So especially those of you in kinesiology need to be familiar with the plan and with these strategies and tactics. So I'm going to close here with just data from one more study showing that I can think a little bit beyond activity and fitness. Paper we published earlier this year, in which it's becoming popular, and there are a number of papers over the last few years on positive health factors. And instead of looking at negative risk factors, let's look at on the positive side, positive health factors. So in this report, here are the 5 positive health factors that we identified. And yes, some of you I know will be absolutely delighted to learn that 0 alcohol intake is a risk factor. So, moderate is good for you. That was kind of a joke too. But anyway, here are the data from this report. Here's the risk of dying set at the reference level of 1 for the men who had none of those positive factors. These guys had any one of the 5 and so forth, and these guys had all 5. And their risk of dying was 61% lower than the guys who had none. I defy you to find any data on any combination of drugs or other medical interventions that reduce the risk of dying 61%. This is the solution, the major solution to our healthcare crisis, both in terms of morbidity and mortality and the cost, is to go to these positive health factors. And of course, which one is most important? Well, you know my answer to that. We have to go in this direction. We have to learn how to deliver these cognitive and behavioral strategies to help people stop smoking, not drink too much, be physically active, eat their fruit and vegetables. And this is a line of research that has grown a lot in the last 15 to 20 years. We've learned a lot about how to help people make and sustain these changes. Now we have to roll this out to the masses. And we can't have everybody who needs to improve some health factor to spend an hour a week with a PhD psychologist. There aren't enough of them, and it costs too much money. We have to learn how to roll this out. And this is where you young people come into focus now. I know how you guys live. You live by text messaging, right? How many text messages? No, I'll ask her. How many text messages a day? 200, 300? We need to use modern technology to deliver these cognitive and behavioral strategies to help people make these changes. And the research on that is beginning to bubble up, and it's positive. But now you younger generation who are living this way, some of you are so young, you don't even know there was a time when there weren't cell phones. So you're growing up with it. You're going to be a lot better at this than my generation or even Dr. Welk's generation. This is what we have to do, and I encourage you. And, of course, the Nutrition Wellness Research Center here is focusing on some of this. And then talking to Dr. Welk today and yesterday, you're probably going to be focusing more on it. This is something to ride. This could make Iowa State rich. If you can figure out how to do this, do it well. It could be, people will say Steve Jobs and Greg Welk in the same sentence. Who knows? So my final message is we have to focus on these healthy behaviors, certainly healthy eating habits. And I'm sorry, you people with an RD, it does not require an RD to give advice. I have no RD, but I'll tell you what you need to do. Eat your fruit and vegetables. Focus on whole grains, not highly processed food. Those are the main things you need to do to have a healthy diet. Now, there are people who need intensive dietary counseling by RDs. I know that. But 95% of the public needs to eat their blasted fruit and vegetables and eat whole grains and not too much saturated fat and no trans fat. That's what you need to know. And regular 3 10-minute walks a day. I can come on the kinesiology side. You do not have to be an ACSM certified exercise trainer to say you should take 3 10-minute walks a day and learn to use these cognitive and behavioral strategies to help people do that. Thank you. Did I babble on too long, Phil, or do you want me to take a few questions? Now, if some of you have to leave, that's fine. Be quiet when you go, or I will lose my temper. And that'd be an ugly sight. So if you have a question, put up your hand. Dr. Martin will give you the mic.
Questions?
What's fitness?
I said be quiet if you're leaving. Thank you.
What's fitness doing to the body that causes reduced mortality?
What does fitness do to lower the risk?
What are the causative factors? What's it doing to the body that causes it?
Well, if you'd asked me that question 15, 20 years ago, I would have said it raises HDL cholesterol and lowers blood pressure. And it probably does, but those are, I don't think, the major pathways. Some of the more recent ones are sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. You get better heart rate variability. Removing blood clots, arterial dilation, and all kinds of things go on in the muscle with more mitochondria and, of course, insulin sensitivity. And we're still learning new biologic pathways whereby activity is beneficial to health, and there are a lot that no one's even thought of, is my guess. Yeah, let's remember, skeletal muscle is the largest organ in the body, unless you are really, really fat. It's the largest organ, and maybe except for the brain, the most metabolically active. I mean, we are critters who evolved to move and use those skeletal muscles. So we can't really do well when we don't do that. So I think there are a myriad of pathways that have yet to be discovered. So yes, there are theses and dissertations that people can do and discover more pathways. Any other questions? Comments? I love to argue.
So you mentioned that, I think you said three 10-minute walks a week.
A day.
A day, okay.
3 10-minute walks a day
Is
is 5.
the intensity an issue there? I mean, is that enough if you had somebody who did 3 10-minute walks a day and then you put them on the treadmill? By definition, would they then have cardiorespiratory fitness, or
Yeah.
they would?
Yeah, if they did 3 10-minute walks a day, 5 days a week, they would be in the moderate fitness category, as I have defined it in our research. It doesn't take an awful lot. It's, not sit so much, move around a bit more. And the current physical activity guideline is 150 minutes a week of moderate. I mean, I broke it up into the 3 10-minute, 5 times a week. But it's 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous, or mix and match. If you do 1 minute of vigorous, you can count that as 2 minutes of moderate. And that's all it takes. It's not a huge amount. We did I think probably the largest single center, tightly controlled dose response exercise trial, 464 postmenopausal women, overweight or obese, mildly hypertensive. Control group, 3 exercise doses. The low dose, and they were all at 50% of maximal capacity, the low dose was 72 minutes a week. They improved their VO2 max 5% compared to controls. I think, Phil, there was a question back. Okay.
I wondering what is your personal opinion for how could you describe fitness? How could you define fitness?
Well, I defined it as saying cardiorespiratory fitness measured by a maximal exercise test on a treadmill. So I could have said aerobic power or VO2 max. I mean, these are synonymous, essentially. There are other kinds of fitness. I didn't go into it tonight, but strength and muscular fitness is also associated with mortality. Stronger people are less likely to die, and even when we adjust for cardiorespiratory fitness, strength still is associated with lower mortality. So there's muscular fitness or strength, cardiorespiratory fitness, there's balance, flexibility, but given the data we have at the moment, it's the cardiorespiratory fitness and the muscular fitness that are most important for health and function. But there are still, again, other kinds of fitness, like, I don't want to disappoint you here, but when you get to be my age, you will find balance fitness goes away. And let me show you how, okay. When I was just a kid and I wanted to put on my underwear, jump up and pull them on, right? And now it's... Better hold on to something. Balance goes. Disappointing. Yes?
Are you able to describe what would happen to, or just with some of the studies that you've looked at, when somebody has fluctuated in weight over time or had different diet trends, and how that affects their fitness or their health overall, and maybe like their death rate, I guess?
Yes, it was 10, 15 years ago, studies on weight variation or weight cycling. I preferred to call it weight variation. Where there were several of them published at that time. We published a large study on that, and the findings were the same really as what I showed you for this work we have in progress. People, now this was in the multiple risk factor intervention trial. These were all men at high risk for coronary heart disease. Those who gained weight, those who lost weight, those whose weight cycled, had higher risk in most cases than the guys whose weight stayed stable. So, I mean, it's a complex thing. I'm not sure I really understand why it turns out that way, but there's just little compelling evidence that weight loss reduces mortality. Weight loss in people at high risk for diabetes will reduce the risk of developing diabetes. But physical activity will also reduce the risk of diabetes, even if you don't lose weight. I mean, there are complex issues to be sorted out. It's not as simple as the obesity cartel puts on the front pages of the newspaper. Probably not as simple as I make out. Okay, he's got one back there, and then there's one up front here, Phil.
Thank you, Dr. Blair, for all of your input today at the NWRC and especially your presentation tonight. I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more insight into how specifically low cardiorespiratory fitness is being attributed to the high mortality rate.
Well, as I said, I think in response to the first question, there are just multiple ways in which activity, biological pathways by which regular activity improves health and function and reduces risk. And remember, fitness is, as I view it, it's simply a marker for an active lifestyle. So if you were fit genetically and were not physically active, would you get health benefits? I don't think we know that at this point. But it's the activity that you do to get fit that works on these many biological pathways, many of which no one's even thought of at this point.
I guess more specifically, I was wondering, like after the fact, after someone passes away, how are you attributing the cause of death to a low cardiorespiratory fitness rate?
Well, we measured their fitness when they were still alive.
Before and okay.
And then followed them until they died, and those with low fitness were more likely to die during that follow-up period. Did I get the point you were
Yeah,
asking?
I think so. I might speak with you in your future visits, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. Phil, maybe one more question up here. I know people are getting antsy. Is he ever going to shut up so we can go home and go get that one alcoholic drink? It was this lady up, Phil, over here, this lady.
Do vegetarians enjoy exercising more, and are they faster runners?
Don't know about the faster runners. Well, I guess I don't know about enjoying exercise more, but we have looked at the extent to which health habits are interrelated, and there's not as much overlap as I thought going into that research. I know people used to say, well, those fit people, they're vegetarian health freaks, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, they're not necessarily. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Some vegetarians are absolute lazy slobs, never exercise. Some vegetarians are triathletes. So there is some overlap, but in the research we've done and what I've seen, it's not a huge amount of overlap. Although there are some people, like in the one slide, the last data slide I showed you, there are some people who practice all 5 of those positive health habits. We all should, of course. Did I get at the point you were... Okay. Oh,
One last thing.
Sorry, I just had one last question. So you said that the amount of calories hasn't increased over the years. Why have all of the portion sizes, like at restaurants and all of the packaged goods, why has that increased if people aren't eating more?
well, first of all, it's increased as a marketing thing, I think. And it's clear that restaurant portion sizes have increased.
Right.
I believe the data that are published on that. It is clear that Americans are eating more meals away from home and more meals in fast food restaurants.
Right.
I think those data are very clear. That is, and you would think that would lead to higher levels of caloric intake.
Right.
But then we spent tens of millions of dollars measuring it, and I don't think there's any compelling evidence that Americans are actually eating more calories per day.
Okay.
I mean, again, we can spend more money, collect more data, and see if there's a trend, but the data we have, I don't believe. Now, I know some of you in the nutrition field are going to say, well, what about the food disappearance data? Are you a nutritionist? Is that what you were
I am
thinking?
a dietetics major, yeah.
Food disappearance data, for those of you that don't know, I guess the Department of Agriculture does this maybe. I don't know who does it. Somebody in the government does it. So they measure how, I don't know that either, all the food that's available in the United States on January 1. and then they measure all the food that's available on December 31, and all the food that was imported, all that was exported, and all that was grown, et cetera. And so they come up with this food disappearance. And in recent years, more calories have disappeared from America than in the past. So some people say, aha, people are eating more because more calories are disappearing from our country. Well, that's true only if eating practices and cooking practices stay the same. Now, let me tell you about my son-in-law and my daughter. I've been in their house, and Brian would go to get a box of cereal for the kids, and he said, oh, this is approaching the expiration date. Into the trash. My grandmother, my mother, my wife, they have never thrown anything out. They might trim off the mold and throw that out. They don't throw it out. So again, this is personal observation, but I suspect there have been those kind of changes. But another that I think we can document, fast food going up. McDonald's buys an awful lot of cooking oil, right? So it disappears from the marketplace. Do people eat that oil? Half of it goes out the back door as industrial waste. So there are complications in getting to this point. But again, I just like to throw the challenge down to the nutrition community. We spent tens of millions of dollars measuring it. We have no compelling evidence that it's gone up. So we can spend tens of millions more and measure it again, and maybe with better measurement tools, maybe we will find that it goes up. To me, it's just much more plausible that occupational energy expenditure and domestic energy expenditure have been going down. And that is the cause, in my opinion. It's an opinion. Well, thank you all very much for your attention.
There's some refreshments at the back of the room if you now want to eat those. Dr. Blair said it was okay.